October 15th, 2019. A decorated veteran stood before Judge Patricia Hargrove in a Michigan courtroom, his chest bearing 5 military medals. But instead of respect, the judge's eyes narrowed with suspicion as she declared them obvious fakes and threatened him with contempt. What happened next when a high-ranking colonel walked through those courtroom doors would expose a truth so shocking that it would end her career. But what could possibly make a judge risk everything to humiliate a war hero in front of an entire courtroom? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 7B in the Washtenaw County Courthouse hummed with their usual monotonous drone as 53-year-old Marcus Brennan adjusted his tie nervously. The fabric felt foreign against his neck. He was more accustomed to combat fatigues than formal wear. His calloused hands, scarred from years of service in places most Americans couldn't pronounce, fumbled with the knot one last time before he gave up. It would have to do. Marcus had been summoned to court for what should have been a routine traffic violation hearing. 3 months earlier, he'd been pulled over for running a red light on his way to a VA hospital appointment. The ticket was fair. He had run the light, distracted by the phantom pain that still shot through his left leg, where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone in Kandahar 7 years ago. He'd planned to pay the fine and move on with his life. But a clerical error had escalated the matter, landing him here, in front of Judge Patricia Hargrove, the bailiff. A stocky man with graying temples named Officer Dennis Kowalski called the courtroom to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hargrove. Marcus stood, his posture instinctively snapping to attention despite the civilian setting. The medals on his chest, 5 of them, each representing moments of valor he wished he could forget, caught the harsh courtroom lighting and glinted softly. The Purple Heart, the Bronze Star with Valor, the Army Commendation Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, the Combat Infantryman Badge. Each one told a story written in blood, sacrifice, and the kind of courage that only surfaces when death is breathing down your neck. Judge Hargrove swept into the courtroom with the air of someone who believed her authority was absolute and unquestionable. At 47, she had built a reputation as a no-nonsense jurist who ran her courtroom with an iron fist. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her already severe features. Her eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room like a predator assessing potential prey. "Be seated," she commanded. Her voice sharp as a whip crack. Marcus lowered himself into the defendant's chair, keenly aware of the dozen or so people scattered throughout the gallery. A young woman with a notepad, probably a law student observing proceedings. An elderly couple holding hands. A man in a wrinkled suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. All of them witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. "Case number 47829, the court clerk announced, her voice barely audible. "The State versus Marcus Brennan. Traffic violation, failure to obey a traffic signal." Judge Hargrove's eyes locked onto Marcus, and something shifted in her expression. It wasn't the neutral professional gaze he'd expected. It was something darker, contemptuous. Her lips curled slightly as her gaze traveled from his face down to the medals adorning his jacket. "Mr. Brennan," she began, her tone dripping with disdain, "I see you've decided to dress up for court today. How theatrical." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he remained silent. Years of military discipline had taught him when to speak and when to bite his tongue. This, he sensed, was a moment for the latter. "Your Honor," his court-appointed attorney, a young man named Jeremy Patterson, who looked fresh out of law school, interjected nervously. "My client is here to address the traffic citation. We're prepared to accept responsibility and pay the appropriate fine." Judge Hargrove waved her hand dismissively, her attention never leaving Marcus. "I'll get to the citation in a moment, Counselor. First, I'm curious about your client's choice of accessories." The courtroom fell silent. Even Officer Kowalski, who had been shuffling papers near the bench, stopped moving. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, charged with an inexplicable tension. "Mr. Brennan," Judge Hargrove continued, leaning forward in her chair, "those medals you're wearing, where exactly did you get them? A costume shop? Perhaps an online military surplus store?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His face flushed, and he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that used to precede combat, the same chemical cocktail of anger and fear that had kept him alive through 3 tours in 2 different war zones. "Your Honor," Jeremy stammered, clearly caught off guard. "I don't understand. My client is a decorated veteran. Those medals were earned through—" "Earned?" Judge Hargrove's laugh was cold and mirthless. "Mr. Patterson, I've seen my share of stolen valor cases. Men who dress up in military regalia they have no right to wear, seeking sympathy or special treatment. It's disgraceful, and I won't tolerate it in my courtroom." Marcus's hands gripped the edge of the defendant's table, his knuckles turning white. The Purple Heart on his chest suddenly felt impossibly heavy, heavier than it had on the day Colonel Morrison had pinned it there in a field hospital in Bagram. While Marcus lay in a bed, his leg held together by titanium rods, and the desperate hope that he'd walk again. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Jeremy tried again, his voice cracking slightly. "My client's military record is a matter of public documentation. He served with distinction in the United States Army for public documentation can be forged. Mr. Patterson, I'm sure you learned that in law school." Judge Hargrove's eyes never left Marcus's face, studying his reaction with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. "Mr. Brennan, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you serve in the military?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Marcus's throat felt tight, his voice trapped somewhere between rage and disbelief. When he finally spoke, his words came out low and controlled, each syllable measured. "Yes, Your Honor, I served for 18 years in the United States Army. I was honorably discharged in 2017. 18 years, Judge Hargrove repeated, her tone mocking. "And in those 18 years, you managed to accumulate quite the collection of medals. How convenient! How very convenient indeed," someone in the gallery gasped. The elderly woman whispered something to her husband, who shook his head in apparent disbelief. The law student's pen moved rapidly across her notepad, capturing every word of the bizarre exchange. Jeremy Patterson looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. His client was being publicly humiliated, accused of stolen valor, one of the most shameful accusations that could be leveled at a veteran, and there seemed to be nothing he could do to stop it. "Your Honor," Jeremy said, his voice stronger now, perhaps fueled by the injustice of what he was witnessing. "This is highly irregular. My client is here for a traffic violation, not to have his military service questioned. I respectfully request that we return to the matter at hand." Judge Hargrove's expression hardened. "Mr. Patterson, I decide what matters are addressed in my courtroom. If I believe someone is attempting to deceive this court by wearing fraudulent military decorations, that is absolutely relevant to their credibility and character." She turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Brennan, I'm going to give you one opportunity to come clean. Remove those fake medals. Admit that you're attempting to exploit false military credentials for sympathy, and we can proceed with your traffic violation. Otherwise, I may find you in contempt of court." The threat hung in the air like a loaded gun. Marcus felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom boring into him. The weight of the accusation, the public shame, the casual dismissal of everything he'd sacrificed, it was almost unbearable. His mind flashed back to Sergeant David Chen, who died in his arms in a dusty Afghan village after a roadside bomb had torn through their convoy. He thought of the months of physical therapy, learning to walk again, while phantom pains screamed through nerves that no longer existed. He remembered the nightmares, the PTSD that had cost him his marriage, the pills he'd needed just to sleep without reliving the worst moments of his life. And now, this judge, sitting in her comfortable chair in her safe courtroom, was calling it all a lie. Marcus stood slowly, his leg protesting the movement. His voice, when it came, was steady despite the storm raging inside him. Your Honor, these medals represent moments I would give anything to forget. They represent friends I've lost, wounds I've suffered, and sacrifices I've made in service of this country. I will not remove them, and I will not be party to this mockery of contempt. Judge Hargrove's voice cracked like thunder. Mr. Brennan, you are in contempt of this court. Officer Kowalski, take him into custody. The bailiff hesitated, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. For a moment it seemed like he might refuse, but duty won out, and he moved toward Marcus, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. That's when the courtroom doors burst open. The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, and every head turned toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway, backlit by the corridor lights, was a figure in full military dress uniform. The eagles on his shoulders gleamed silver, a full colonel. His chest was adorned with rows of ribbons that spoke of decades of service, his bearing unmistakably that of a career soldier who commanded respect without having to demand it. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the colonel's eyes swept the scene before him. The bailiff approaching Marcus with handcuffs, the judge's furious expression, the medals on Marcus's chest, and the palpable tension that filled the air like electricity before a lightning strike. Judge Hargrove's face had gone pale. "Who are you? And what is the meaning of this interruption?" The colonel's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of authority earned through years of command, through decisions made in the crucible of combat, through the kind of leadership that inspired men and women to follow you into hell itself, Your Honor. My name is Colonel Robert Fitzgerald, United States Army, and I believe you've made a terrible mistake. Colonel Robert Fitzgerald strode into courtroom 7B with the measured confidence of a man who had commanded soldiers in the most dangerous corners of the world. At 58, his posture remained ramrod straight, his grey hair cut in a regulation high and tight that he'd maintained since his days as a second lieutenant fresh out of West Point. The ribbons on his chest told a story of a career spanning 3 decades, campaigns in Iraq, Afghanistan, peacekeeping missions in the Balkans, counterterrorism operations that remained classified even now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Judge Hargrove recovered from her initial shock, her face flushing red with indignation. "Colonel, this is a civilian courtroom. You have no jurisdiction here, and your interruption is completely inappropriate. I could hold you in contempt as well." Fitzgerald's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a hardness that suggested this was not a man accustomed to being intimidated by threats. He moved further into the courtroom, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor with military precision. "Your Honor, I apologize for the dramatic entrance," Fitzgerald said, his tone respectful but unyielding. "However, I was informed by Captain Sarah Henderson at the VA hospital that one of my former soldiers was being accused of stolen valor in this courtroom. Given the severity of such accusations, I felt my immediate presence was necessary." Marcus's eyes widened in recognition. Colonel Fitzgerald, the man who had led their battalion during the deadliest months of their deployment. The officer who had personally carried Private Tommy Ramirez through enemy fire after an ambush, refusing to leave a man behind, even when bullets tore through the air like angry hornets. Marcus hadn't seen him in 6 years, not since the retirement ceremony at Fort Benning, where Fitzgerald had handed over command and closed a chapter on a legendary military career. "This is highly irregular," Jeremy Patterson whispered, though relief was evident in his voice. For the first time since the hearing began, he felt like the tide might be turning. Judge Hargrove's jaw clenched. "Colonel Fitzgerald, I don't care about your military rank or your dramatic sense of timing. This court operates under civilian law, and I am the authority here. Your former soldier, if that's even true, is wearing what I believe to be fraudulent military decorations, and I will not allow—" "Fraudulent?" Fitzgerald's voice cut through her words like a blade. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Your Honor, before you continue down this path, I strongly suggest you reconsider your position. The man standing before you is not a fraud. He is Staff Sergeant Marcus Brennan, and I know this because I personally recommended him for 2 of those medals you've dismissed as fake. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The elderly couple in the gallery leaned forward, suddenly riveted by the unfolding drama. The law student's pen flew across her notepad so fast, it was a wonder the paper didn't catch fire. Officer Kowalski, who had frozen in place with the handcuffs still in his hands, slowly backed away from Marcus, a look of profound discomfort crossing his features. Judge Hargrove's face had gone from red to pale, but she wasn't backing down. "Colonel, I respect your service, but personal testimony doesn't constitute proof. Anyone could walk in here and claim to know this man. I require documented evidence, not emotional appeals." Fitzgerald reached into the leather portfolio he'd been carrying and extracted a thick manila folder. He approached the bench with deliberate steps, placing the folder in front of Judge Hargrove with a quiet authority that made her flinch slightly. "In this folder, Your Honor, you'll find Staff Sergeant Brennan's complete military record, his DD-214 discharge papers, citations for each medal he's wearing, after action reports from engagements in Helmand Province and Kandahar, medical records documenting the injuries that resulted in his Purple Heart." Fitzgerald's voice remained level, professional, but there was an undercurrent of steel beneath his words. "You'll also find my personal contact information, as well as the contact information for Major General Theodore Walsh, who commanded our division during Operation Enduring Freedom. I'm certain the General would be happy to verify Staff Sergeant Brennan's service record. Should you require additional confirmation?" Judge Hargrove opened the folder with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the documents. Each page seemed to drain more color from her face. The official seals, the signatures, the photographs of Marcus in uniform standing alongside other soldiers in dusty combat zones. It was all there, irrefutable and damning to her accusations. "The Bronze Star with Valor," Fitzgerald continued, pointing to the medal on Marcus's chest, "was awarded for actions on November 7th, 2012, when Staff Sergeant Brennan's convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar. Despite being wounded by shrapnel from an improvised explosive device, he pulled 2 soldiers from a burning vehicle while under sustained enemy fire. Private First Class Daniel Woods and Specialist James Ortega are alive today because Marcus Brennan refused to abandon them." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz more quietly, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "The Purple Heart," Fitzgerald went on, his voice carrying the weight of memory, "was earned that same day when that shrapnel tore through his leg. He spent 8 months in recovery, underwent 4 surgeries, and had to relearn how to walk. The doctors said he'd never serve in the field again, but he fought his way back. He completed another full tour before his discharge." Marcus felt tears burning at the corners of his eyes, memories flooding back with painful clarity. The smell of burning metal and flesh, the screams of wounded men, the impossible heat of the Afghan sun beating down on them while they fought for their lives. Daniel Woods, who now taught high school history in Ohio and sent Marcus Christmas cards every year. James Ortega, who'd named his daughter Marcella in honor of the man who'd saved his life. Judge Hargrove's hands were shaking now as she flipped through the pages. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by something that looked like growing horror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. "The Army Commendation Medal," Fitzgerald continued relentlessly, "was for his work training Afghan National Army soldiers, helping build the capacity of local forces under incredibly difficult circumstances. The Afghanistan Campaign Medal speaks for itself, recognition of his service in that theater of operations. And the Combat Infantryman Badge is awarded only to infantry soldiers who have actively engaged the enemy in ground combat." Jeremy Patterson had stopped taking notes. He simply sat there watching as his client's honor was not just defended, but proclaimed to the entire courtroom. This was no longer about a traffic ticket. This had become something far more significant, a moment of reckoning. "Colonel Fitzgerald," Judge Hargrove began, her voice considerably quieter now, I was simply doing my due diligence. There have been cases of stolen valor in this county, and I thought, "You thought wrong, Your Honor." Fitzgerald's words were not shouted, but they carried the force of absolute conviction. Due diligence would have involved asking to see documentation before publicly humiliating a decorated veteran. Due diligence would have meant treating this soldier with the respect he earned through blood and sacrifice. Instead, you chose to mock him, to accuse him of fraud, to threaten him with contempt, all based on nothing more than your own prejudices and assumptions. The law student in the gallery had stopped writing entirely. She was simply staring. Witnessing what she would later tell her classmates was the most extraordinary moment she'd ever seen in a courtroom. "These medals aren't costume jewelry or props for sympathy," Fitzgerald said, his voice dropping lower but losing none of its intensity. "Each one represents a moment when Marcus Brennan put his life on the line for this country, when he ran toward danger instead of away from it, when he chose to serve something greater than himself. And you, from the safety and comfort of your bench, decided they were fake." Judge Hargrove's face had gone completely white. The folder lay open before her, each document a testament to her catastrophic error in judgment. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time, and seemed to see not a defendant in a minor traffic case, but a man who had given years of his life in service to his nation. "Staff Sergeant Brennan," Fitzgerald said. Turning to Marcus, "I apologize that you had to endure this. You deserved better. You've always deserved better." Marcus's voice was thick with emotion when he finally spoke. "Thank you, sir. I never expected. I didn't know anyone had contacted you. Captain Henderson called me the moment she heard what was happening," Fitzgerald explained. "She's been coordinating with the VA Advocate's office. Apparently there's been a pattern." Those last words hung in the air ominously. Judge Hargrove's head snapped up, her eyes widening. "A pattern?" Jeremy Patterson asked, finding his voice again. Fitzgerald turned back to face the judge, and his expression had hardened into something cold and unforgiving. "Your Honor, Staff Sergeant Brennan isn't the first veteran to face accusations of stolen valor in your courtroom, is he?" The question hung in the courtroom like a sword suspended by a thread. Judge Hargrove's face transformed through a spectrum of emotions: shock, fear, and finally, defensive anger. Her fingers gripped the edge of the bench so tightly her knuckles went bone white. "I don't know what you're implying, Colonel," she said, her voice brittle as thin ice. "Every case I've presided over has been handled according to the law and with appropriate scrutiny." Colonel Fitzgerald pulled a second folder from his portfolio, this one noticeably thicker than the first. He didn't approach the bench this time. Instead, he held it up for the courtroom to see, a silent but damning piece of evidence. "Over the past 14 months, Fitzgerald began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone presenting a briefing to superior officers. 6 veterans have appeared in your courtroom for various minor offenses. Traffic violations, mostly. One case of disturbing the peace. In every single instance, you questioned the authenticity of their military service. In 4 of those cases, you accused them of stolen valor." The elderly man in the gallery sat forward, his weathered face creasing with concern. His wife clutched his arm, her eyes fixed on the colonel. The law student was writing again, her hand moving frantically to capture every word. Jeremy Patterson felt his pulse quicken. This was no longer just about defending his client. This was about exposing something far more systemic and troubling. "That's absurd," Judge Hargrove snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. "I've had hundreds of cases come through this courtroom. If some of them happen to involve veterans, that's simply coincidence. And if I questioned their credentials, it was because something seemed suspicious." "Suspicious," Fitzgerald repeated, his tone flat. "Your Honor, let me share some details about those 6 veterans. Sergeant First Class William Tucker, Marine Corps, served 2 tours in Iraq. You accused him of wearing a fraudulent Marine Corps emblem on his jacket and threatened to report him to federal authorities. He left your courtroom humiliated, despite having documentation in his vehicle that he was never given the opportunity to present. Judge Hargrove opened her mouth to respond, but Fitzgerald continued without pause. Petty Officer Second Class Angela Morrison, Navy, served aboard the USS Cole after the bombing, providing support and security during repairs. You questioned whether women actually served in combat zones and suggested her service ribbon was purchased online. She was so traumatized by the experience that she filed a formal complaint with the State Judicial Review Board. Marcus felt something shift inside him. He wasn't alone. Others had endured this same nightmare, this same casual dismissal of their sacrifice. The knowledge was simultaneously comforting and enraging. Corporal Jamal Washington, Army National Guard, deployed to New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina and later to Afghanistan. You implied that National Guard service didn't count as real military experience and mocked his deployment patches. He's currently in therapy for PTSD that was significantly worsened by his experience in your courtroom. Officer Kowalski, still standing awkwardly near Marcus with the unused handcuffs, looked increasingly uncomfortable. His own brother had served in the Air Force, and the bailiff's face had taken on a greenish pallor as he listened to the colonel's litany of accusations. Specialist Raymond Chen, Army medic, served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. You questioned whether his combat medical badge was legitimate because, and I quote from the court transcript, he didn't look like someone who'd seen combat. He was 23 years old when he held dying soldiers in his arms, and you dismissed his service because of his appearance. Judge Hargrove's defensive anger was crumbling, replaced by something that looked like panic. Her eyes darted around the courtroom as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Staff Sergeant Nicole Diaz, Air Force drone operator who flew combat missions over Syria. You suggested that sitting in an air-conditioned room pushing buttons wasn't real military service and didn't warrant the medals she'd been awarded. She left your courtroom in tears. Fitzgerald paused, letting the weight of each story settle over the courtroom like a suffocating blanket. The law student had stopped writing and was simply staring at Judge Hargrove with undisguised horror. And finally, Chief Petty Officer Robert Lansing, Navy SEAL, 30 years of service. Multiple deployments to classified locations. You questioned whether he was too old to have actually served as a SEAL and suggested he was exploiting veteran sympathy for a minor parking violation. A Navy SEAL, Your Honor. A man who has done things for this country that you and I will never be cleared to know about. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion, not just for himself, but for all of them. William Tucker, Angela Morrison, Jamal Washington, Raymond Chen, Nicole Diaz, Robert Lansing. 7 veterans who had committed no crime greater than minor traffic infractions, all subjected to public humiliation and accusations of fraud. These are serious allegations, Jeremy Patterson said, finding his courage. If what Colonel Fitzgerald is saying is accurate, this represents a clear pattern of bias against veterans appearing in your honor's courtroom. Judge Hargrove's face had gone from pale to flushed, a splotchy red creeping up her neck. This is character assassination, she said, her voice rising. You're taking isolated incidents and constructing a narrative that doesn't exist. I have the right to question anyone who appears in my courtroom. That's my job. Your job, Fitzgerald said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, is to administer justice fairly and impartially. Your job is not to use your position to belittle, humiliate, and accuse honorable men and women of fraud based on nothing more than the fact that they served their country. He stepped closer to the bench, and despite the physical distance between them, Judge Hargrove seemed to shrink back. I've spent 33 years in the military. Your Honor, I've commanded soldiers in peace and war. I've written commendations and reprimands. I've conducted investigations and overseen disciplinary proceedings. And in all that time, I've learned to recognize certain patterns of behavior. His eyes locked onto hers with laser-like intensity. What you've demonstrated isn't judicial scrutiny. It's contempt. Contempt for the military, contempt for those who serve, and contempt for sacrifice you clearly don't understand or value. The elderly man in the gallery suddenly stood up, his movement drawing everyone's attention. He was perhaps 75, with the weathered features of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. His hands, gnarled with age, trembled slightly as he pointed at Judge Hargrove. "I served in Vietnam," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I came home to protesters spitting on me, calling me a baby killer. I thought those days were over. I thought we'd learn to respect the people who serve, even if we don't agree with the wars they fight." Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. "My grandson is in the Marines. He's deployed right now, and I'm terrified that when he comes home he'll face this hatred from the very people he's protecting." His wife stood beside him, gripping his arm for support. She looked at Marcus with such profound sympathy that he had to look away. Judge Hargrove's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked like a fish drowning in air, desperate and panicked. "Your Honor," Fitzgerald said, his voice cutting through the emotional moment with surgical precision. "I'm not just here as a character witness for Staff Sergeant Brennan. I'm here representing the Veterans Affairs Advocacy Office, the Military Officers Association, and several veterans' rights organizations. We've been building a case file on your conduct for the past 6 months. Ever since Petty Officer Morrison filed her complaint." He placed the thick folder on the defendant's table, its weight landing with an audible thud that seemed to echo through the courtroom. This folder contains transcripts from each of those cases, witness statements, complaints filed with the Judicial Review Board, and affidavits from the veterans you've targeted. We also have statements from attorneys who've appeared before you, court staff who've witnessed your behavior, and even other judges who've expressed concern about your treatment of veterans. Judge Hargrove's hand moved to her throat, an unconscious gesture of vulnerability. You're building a case against me." "We're documenting a pattern of judicial misconduct," Fitzgerald corrected. "And what happened here today, your treatment of Staff Sergeant Brennan, your baseless accusations, your threat to hold a decorated combat veteran in contempt for refusing to remove medals he earned through blood and courage. This is the final piece of evidence we needed." Jeremy Patterson's eyes widened. "Your Honor, in light of these revelations, I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my client, and I formally request that this court acknowledge the wrongful accusations made against Staff Sergeant Brennan." Officer Kowalski had quietly retreated to the side of the courtroom, the handcuffs now conspicuously absent from his hands. He stood at attention, his own military bearing evident in his posture, a silent show of solidarity with Marcus and the other veterans who'd been wronged. Judge Hargrove looked around the courtroom, seeming to realize for the first time how completely the situation had turned against her. The law student was documenting everything. The elderly veteran and his wife were witnesses to her downfall. Officer Kowalski had chosen a side, and it wasn't hers. Even the court clerk was watching with barely concealed disapproval. "Colonel Fitzgerald," Judge Hargrove began, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens now?" Colonel Fitzgerald studied Judge Hargrove with the same analytical gaze he'd once used to assess enemy positions before ordering his troops forward. There was no satisfaction in his expression, only a weary determination, the look of a man doing an unpleasant but necessary duty. "What happens now," he said slowly, "depends largely on you, Your Honor. The Michigan Judicial Tenure Commission will receive our complete file within 48 hours. They'll launch a formal investigation into your conduct. Given the documented pattern of behavior, the multiple complaints, and the severity of the allegations, I expect they'll move quickly." Judge Hargrove's hand trembled as she reached for the water glass on her bench. She took a sip, but it did nothing to restore color to her ashen face. An investigation, she repeated, the words seeming to stick in her throat. This will destroy my career. Your career? Marcus spoke for the first time since Colonel Fitzgerald's arrival, his voice low but filled with restrained fury. 7 veterans came through your courtroom seeking justice for minor violations. We weren't asking for special treatment. We weren't looking for sympathy. We just wanted the same fair hearing anyone else would receive. And instead, you used your power to humiliate us, to question our honor, to accuse us of lying about the worst and best moments of our lives. He stood, his leg protesting the sudden movement, but his posture remained straight. The medals on his chest caught the light, each one representing a story Judge Hargrove had dismissed as fiction. Do you know what it's like to come home from war, Your Honor? To try to rebuild a normal life when your mind is still trapped in a combat zone, when every loud noise sounds like an explosion, when you wake up at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat, seeing the faces of friends who didn't make it home. Marcus's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed forward. We come home carrying invisible wounds that never fully heal, and then we encounter people like you, who see our service as something to be mocked, questioned, treated with suspicion. The law student in the gallery was crying quietly, her hand pressed to her mouth. The elderly Vietnam veteran had sat back down, his wife holding him as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. I divorced my wife because I couldn't sleep next to her without waking up swinging at shadows, Marcus continued, each word landing like a hammer blow. I lost a job I loved because the panic attacks made it impossible to function. I spent 2 years in and out of VA hospitals, trying to put my mind back together. And through all of that, the one thing that kept me going was knowing that I'd done something that mattered, that those medals meant something, that my sacrifice counted for something. He gestured to the bronze star on his chest. Daniel Wood sends me a card every Christmas. His daughter is 7 years old now. She draws pictures of superheroes and writes my name at the bottom because her father told her I saved his life. James Ortega named his little girl after me. When I'm at my lowest, when the darkness gets too heavy, I think about those children growing up with their fathers because I didn't give up that day. Judge Hargrove's head was bowed, her eyes fixed on the documents before her, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. And you called it fake, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper now. You looked at these medals and saw costume jewelry. You looked at me and saw a con artist trying to exploit sympathy. You never once considered that you might be wrong, that your assumptions might be destroying someone who'd already given everything they had. Jeremy Patterson stood beside his client, one hand on Marcus's shoulder in silent support. Your Honor, the damage done here goes beyond legal misconduct. Staff Sergeant Brennan came to this courtroom for a routine traffic hearing. He's leaving traumatized, humiliated, and re-victimized by a system that should have protected him. Colonel Fitzgerald opened another section of his folder, revealing what appeared to be medical records and psychological evaluations. After Petty Officer Morrison's experience in your courtroom, her PTSD symptoms intensified dramatically. She required emergency psychiatric intervention. Corporal Washington has been hospitalized twice in the past year for suicidal ideation, both incidents occurring within weeks of his appearance before you. Specialist Chen abandoned his plans to attend medical school because he no longer felt worthy of pursuing his dreams. Each revelation landed like a physical blow. Judge Hargrove's carefully constructed facade of judicial authority had completely crumbled, leaving behind a woman confronting the devastating consequences of her actions. Why? The question came from Officer Kowalski, who'd remained silent throughout the proceedings. His voice was rough with emotion. Your Honor, I don't understand. My brother served in the Air Force. I know what military families sacrifice. Why would you target veterans like this? It was a question everyone in the courtroom wanted answered. Judge Hargrove remained silent for a long moment, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. I don't know, she finally whispered. I honestly don't know. That's not good enough, the elderly Vietnam veteran called out from the gallery. His voice, though aged, carried the strength of righteous anger. Those boys and girls put their lives on the line. They deserve better than I don't know. Colonel Fitzgerald closed his folder with deliberate precision. Your Honor, the investigation will attempt to determine your motivations. Perhaps there's some personal history that explains this behavior. Perhaps it's simply a deep-seated bias that went unchecked for too long. Whatever the reason, it doesn't excuse the harm you've caused. He turned to Marcus, his expression softening slightly. Staff Sergeant Brennan, you came here today for a traffic violation hearing. I believe that matter should be resolved immediately and appropriately. Judge Hargrove looked up, seeming to realize that she still had a nominal case before her. The traffic citation, she said mechanically. Yes, Mr. Brennan, given the circumstances and the clerical error that escalated this matter unnecessarily, I'm dismissing all charges. The citation is hereby vacated. With prejudice, Jeremy Patterson added quickly. So, it cannot be refiled. With prejudice, Judge Hargrove agreed, her voice hollow. But the courtroom knew that dismissing a traffic ticket was meaningless in the face of everything that had been revealed. This was no longer about a red light run during a moment of distraction. This was about systematic abuse of power, about veterans being targeted and humiliated, about wounds reopened by the very system meant to provide impartial justice. I'll need to recuse myself from all pending cases involving veterans, Judge Hargrove said, the words coming out mechanically as if she were reading from a script. And I'll cooperate fully with the investigation. Colonel Fitzgerald nodded curtly. The Michigan Judicial Tenure Commission will be in contact. I'd suggest you retain legal counsel, Your Honor. These allegations are serious enough that they may result in formal disciplinary proceedings, including the possibility of removal from the bench. The finality of those words seemed to break something in Judge Hargrove. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made several people in the gallery flinch. This court is adjourned, she announced, her voice cracking. Without waiting for the traditional procedures, without allowing Officer Kowalski to announce her departure, she fled the courtroom through the door behind the bench. The sound of her rapid footsteps echoed in the hallway beyond, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. The courtroom sat in stunned silence for several heartbeats. Then slowly people began to move. The law student gathered her notes with shaking hands. The elderly veteran and his wife stood, the old man straightening his shoulders as if coming to attention one final time. He approached Marcus slowly, extending a weathered hand. Son, I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I'm glad you stood your ground. We need to stand up for each other. That's what brothers in arms do. Marcus shook his hand, feeling the strength in that aged grip. Thank you, sir. And thank you for your service. Thank you for yours, the old man replied, his eyes glistening. Welcome home, soldier. Welcome home. It was a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of recognition, respect, and brotherhood. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he'd been carrying since the moment Judge Hargrove had first questioned his medals. Officer Kowalski approached next, his own hand extended. Staff Sergeant, I apologize for almost putting you in cuffs. I was following orders, but I should have questioned them. I should have stood up sooner. Marcus accepted his handshake. You were doing your job. I understand chain of command. There's a difference between following orders and enabling injustice, Kowalski said firmly. I'll be providing a statement to the Judicial Tenure Commission. What I witnessed today was wrong, and I won't be silent about it. Colonel Fitzgerald placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. How are you holding up, Brennan? Marcus took a shaky breath. Honestly, sir, I don't know. Part of me feels vindicated. Part of me just feels tired. Tired of fighting battles that shouldn't need to be fought. I understand, Fitzgerald said quietly. But you won today, not just for yourself, but for every veteran who's been through that woman's courtroom. Your willingness to stand your ground, to refuse to remove those medals, even when threatened with contempt, that took courage. The same courage you showed in Kandahar. What happens now, sir? After the investigation? Fitzgerald's expression turned grim. That depends on what the commission finds. At minimum, she'll likely face censure and mandatory retraining. More likely, given the severity and the pattern, she'll be removed from the bench entirely. Her legal career is effectively over. Marcus nodded slowly, processing the information. He felt no joy in Judge Hargrove's downfall, only a weary sense that justice, though delayed, was finally being served. 3 months later, Marcus Brennan sat in a coffee shop in downtown Ann Arbor, watching the autumn leaves spiral past the window. The season had changed, from the sweltering heat of that October courtroom to the crisp chill of January. His hands wrapped around a warm mug, the familiar ritual grounding him in the present moment. Across from him sat Angela Morrison, the Navy petty officer who'd been one of Judge Hargrove's earlier victims. She was younger than Marcus had expected, only 32, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Between them on the table lay a newspaper, its headline bold and uncompromising: Judge Patricia Hargrove removed from bench following misconduct investigation. "I never thought we'd actually see this day," Angela said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief. "When I filed my complaint last year, the Judicial Review Board sent me a form letter acknowledging receipt. I assumed it would disappear into some bureaucratic void and nothing would change." Marcus nodded, understanding completely. "I felt the same way when Colonel Fitzgerald first told me they were building a case. The system protects its own. Judges especially. They have so much power, so much authority. Who was going to believe a bunch of veterans with PTSD over someone in a black robe?" "But they did believe us," Angela said, tapping the newspaper. "The Michigan Judicial Tenure Commission voted unanimously to remove her. The investigation found a pattern of conduct that violated judicial ethics codes, demonstrated bias against a protected class of citizens, and caused measurable psychological harm to multiple veterans." The coffee shop buzzed with the ambient noise of students studying, professionals taking meetings, and friends catching up. Normal life, continuing its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the small victories and devastating losses that shaped individual lives. Jamal Washington arrived next, pushing through the door with a gust of cold air. The National Guard corporal looked healthier than his file photos suggested, his eyes clearer, his posture more relaxed. He spotted Marcus and Angela and made his way over, unwinding a thick scarf from his neck. "Sorry I'm late," he said, pulling out a chair. "VA appointment ran long, but I come bearing good news." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails until he found what he was looking for. The Veterans Legal Advocacy Coalition just announced they're establishing new protocols for Michigan courts. Any judge who questions a veteran's service will be required to allow immediate presentation of documentation, and baseless accusations of stolen valor will be grounds for judicial review. "They're calling it the Brennan Protocol," Angela added with a slight smile. "You're famous, Marcus." Marcus felt his cheeks flush. "I didn't do anything special. I just refused to back down." "That's exactly what made it special," Jamal countered. "You stood your ground when she threatened you with contempt. You didn't remove those medals, didn't apologize for your service, didn't let her intimidate you into silence. That took guts, brother." The door chimed again, and William Tucker entered, the Marine Sergeant First Class who'd been Judge Hargrove's first documented victim. He was a mountain of a man, 6'4", with shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway. But his smile was warm as he joined their growing group. "This everyone?" William asked, glancing around. "Raymond and Nicole couldn't make it," Angela explained. "Raymond's back in school, finally pursuing that medical degree. And Nicole's got duty this weekend. But Robert's on his way." As if summoned by her words, Chief Petty Officer Robert Lansing appeared, the former Navy SEAL moving with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to be invisible when necessary. At 63, he was the oldest of Judge Hargrove's victims, but age had done nothing to diminish the intensity in his gaze. "Apologies," he said simply, taking the last available seat. "Traffic." They sat in silence for a moment, 7 veterans, 6 present, 1 absent in spirit, united by an experience none of them had deserved. The newspaper article lay between them, like a trophy they'd collectively earned through pain and perseverance. "I spoke with Colonel Fitzgerald this morning," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "He wanted me to pass along his congratulations to all of you. The Advocacy Office considers this a landmark case. They're using our documentation as a model for identifying and addressing judicial bias in other jurisdictions. Other states are having similar problems?" William asked, his brow furrowing. "More than we realized," Marcus confirmed. "Turns out Hargrove wasn't unique. There are judges across the country who've demonstrated similar patterns, targeting veterans, questioning their service, treating them with suspicion or contempt. Our case is helping advocates build frameworks to identify and address this behavior before it escalates." Angela leaned back in her chair, processing this information. "So we weren't just fighting for ourselves. We were fighting for veterans we'll never meet. In courtrooms we'll never see. That's how it works," Robert said, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of someone who'd spent decades shouting orders over gunfire and helicopter rotors. "Every battle you fight, every position you hold, you're doing it for the people who'll come after you. That's service. It doesn't end when you take off the uniform." Jamal pulled out a folder from his backpack, placing it on the table. "Speaking of service, I've been working with the local Veterans Advocacy Group. We're organizing a support network for veterans dealing with legal issues, everything from traffic tickets to housing disputes, making sure they have someone in their corner who understands what they've been through. That's incredible," Marcus said, feeling a surge of pride for this man he'd only recently met, but already considered a brother. "We want you to be part of it," Jamal said, looking directly at Marcus. "Your name carries weight now. Veterans trust you. Having you involved could help us reach people who might otherwise suffer in silence, just like we did." Marcus felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. But it wasn't the crushing burden of judgment or accusation. It was the familiar weight of responsibility, the same feeling he'd carried when leading his squad through hostile territory, when making decisions that could mean the difference between soldiers coming home alive or in flag-draped coffins. "I'm in," he said without hesitation. "Whatever you need." William pulled out his own phone, showing them a social media page. The story went viral after the Commission's ruling. Major news outlets picked it up. There's been an outpouring of support from the veteran community and civilians alike. People are angry about what happened to us, and they want to help. The phone screen showed hundreds of comments, thousands of shares, a digital chorus of voices demanding better treatment for those who'd served. Marcus scrolled through them, reading messages from veterans who'd experienced similar treatment, from family members outraged on behalf of their loved ones, from civilians who'd never worn a uniform but understood that what had happened was fundamentally wrong. One comment in particular caught his eye. "My grandfather came home from Waterloo and never talked about his service. He kept his medals in a box in the attic. When I asked him why, he said he didn't want people to think he was showing off or looking for pity." Reading this story, I wonder how many other veterans felt that same shame, that fear of being questioned or dismissed. Thank you for standing up. Thank you for fighting this battle so others won't have to." Marcus felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He'd spent so much time feeling isolated, believing his struggles were his alone to bear. The idea that his willingness to stand his ground had sparked something larger, had given voice to veterans who'd suffered in silence. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. "What about Hargrove?" Angela asked quietly. "Has anyone heard what happened to her after the ruling?" Robert nodded slowly. "I have some contacts in legal circles. From what I understand, she's withdrawn from public life entirely. Her law license is under review. There's been talk of civil suits from some of us, though personally I think we've won what mattered most." "Justice," William said simply. "Acknowledgement," Jamal added. "Recognition that what she did was wrong, that we deserved better. Accountability," Angela finished. "She can't hurt anyone else now." Marcus looked around the table at these 5 people, strangers 3 months ago, brothers and sisters in arms now. They'd been wounded not by bullets or bombs, but by words, by abuse of power, by a system that had failed them. And they'd fought back not with violence, but with truth, with documentation, with the courage to stand together when standing alone had seemed impossible. To Colonel Fitzgerald, Marcus said, raising his coffee mug, for believing us when it would have been easier to dismiss us. To Officer Kowalski, Angela added, lifting her own cup, for finding the courage to speak truth to power. To every veteran who filed a complaint, gave a statement or shared their story, Jamal continued. To us, William said, his deep voice resonating with emotion, for refusing to be silenced. They clinked their mugs together, an informal ceremony that carried the weight of ritual. Outside, the January wind rattled the windows, but inside the coffee shop, 7 veterans, 6 present, 1 in spirit, had found something that had eluded them in Judge Hargrove's courtroom: dignity, respect, and the recognition they'd earned through sacrifice. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Daniel Woods, the soldier whose life he'd saved in Kandahar. Saw the news. Proud of you, brother. You saved me again, saved a lot of us. Semper Fi, even though I know your army. He smiled, typing back a quick response, then looked up at the group around him. So what's next? We've won this battle, but the war's not over. Robert leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with purpose. Next, we make sure this never happens again. We build the support networks Jamal mentioned. We educate judges and court personnel about veterans' issues. We create accountability measures that protect veterans from this kind of abuse. We turn our pain into purpose. Hooah, Marcus said softly, using the old army expression of affirmation. Hoo-yah, Robert responded with the Navy equivalent. Semper Fi, William added, the Marine Corps motto. Aim high, Angela said, invoking the Air Force slogan. Always ready, always there. Jamal finished with the National Guard motto. Different branches, different experiences, different wars, fought in different times and places. But in that moment, in that coffee shop in Ann Arbor, Michigan, they were united by something stronger than service branch rivalry or generational divide. They were united by shared trauma, transformed into collective action, by individual courage that had sparked systemic change, by the understanding that their fight had been about something larger than themselves. Marcus looked down at the medals on his chest. He wore them less frequently now, but today had seemed appropriate. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the ribbons and badges that told his story. Judge Hargrove had called them fake, had tried to strip them of meaning and legitimacy, but she'd been wrong. These medals weren't just metal and ribbon. They were promises kept, sacrifices honored, courage recognized. They were proof that when faced with impossible choices, some people run toward danger instead of away from it. They were symbols of a debt that could never fully be repaid, but that a grateful nation had tried to acknowledge. And now, they were also reminders of another kind of courage, the strength to stand up to authority when it became tyrannical, to speak truth when silence seemed safer, to fight for justice even when the odds seemed overwhelming. The coffee shop continued its rhythm around them, ordinary life proceeding with blessed indifference. But for these veterans, nothing would ever be quite ordinary again. They'd been wounded, they'd fought back, and they'd won, not just for themselves, but for every veteran who would come after them, who would walk into a courtroom and be treated with the respect and dignity they'd earned. Marcus Brennan, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, retired, looked around the table at his fellow warriors and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the naive hope of someone who'd never seen darkness, but the hard-earned hope of someone who'd stared into the abyss and refused to blink. The battle was over. The war continued, and they would face it together, as they always had, with courage, with honor, and with an unwavering commitment to protect those who could not protect themselves. Outside, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the street. A new day was beginning, and for 7 veterans who'd refused to surrender their dignity, it was a day filled with possibility, purpose, and the promise of justice finally righteously served. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.